Hi folks, it's Coach Kelvin here from the We Run Virtual Run Club and We Run Coach for Leeds and surrounding areas, as well as online coaching. In this little video, I'd like to share some thoughts on the final couple of training blocks that lead up to your taper, and then the taper itself and how that can kind of affect our performance on race day. So quite often we hear people say, we quite often get comments like, my longest run in training was only 16 miles for a marathon and it felt really, really hard. How am I possibly going to run, 26.2 miles? If training's been going well, to a certain degree, we've got to trust the training. And what I say to runners is that, we're not going to ask you to run 26.2 miles at the very end of like a build week 3 after a big race specific training block. The taper is a really special thing that works wonders in shedding fatigue out of our legs. So when we run these kind of tougher workouts in training, we've got to always remember that we're doing it on fatigue legs, and we're accumulating fatigue over weeks and months in order to drive strength and endurance gains. And that's kind of where the taper thing can come in, is that, then we taper to shed the fatigue to leave us fresh on race day. That runner who thinks it's, I don't know, maybe a 16-mile long run just felt really, really tough. They're not doing that on fresh legs. We're trying to drive different training adaptations. So after a taper, that runner will then be able to run like much further or much faster with that fatigue taken out of the equation that the taper does. Now, tapers are usually around, there can be anything from 1 to 3 weeks, depending on the race and depending on the runner. I'm not really going to talk about race-specific tapers at the moment, or tapers for people that are predominantly fast twitch or slow twitch dominant runners, because that can make a little bit of difference. Let's just talk about the taper itself. So the chances are for most races, let's say kind of like anything from a half marathon upwards, so half marathons and marathons, it's going to be somewhere around 2 weeks. And the first week of the taper is generally going to be about half the volume of your previous week. So half your volume of the previous week. And then the second week of the taper that has the race at the end of it is going to be about half the volume of the first week in the taper. So we kind of cut volume by half twice. But one thing that's quite important to remember is we really want to keep a similar, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but similar frequency of running and also a similar intensity split. We certainly don't want to start taking loads of intensity out of the equation in the taper. We still want to keep those legs nice and kind of poppy and ready for the event. So that's a little bit about how we decrease the training load as we get closer to a race in those final 2 weeks. The other thing that's really important that I quite often say to runners is, you've probably just come out of some quite tough training before a taper, and we've probably been paying particular attention to hydration and nutrition and sleep. So that rest and recovery that builds us up nice and strong and ready to race. And we need to pay as much attention, if not more attention, to this in the taper as well. So, what I like to think is, please spend the same amount of time in your taper as you would in the peak training block. So the time when you're not actually out running, use that to rest and recover, batch cook, eat more, sleep, make sure your hydration strategy is in place. So still use that time really effectively. It's not uncommon for people to be like, oh yeah, I was in the last week of my taper, so I cleared the garage out or something like that. We don't really want to be doing anything physical, on top of what we're already doing in terms of the decreased volume of running. So do bear these things in mind. So the way that the accumulating fatigue works, and on fatigue legs, those workouts later in the training are going to feel quite tough, and that's fine. And then in the taper, a well managed taper, we shed fatigue. The taper is quite a magical thing, and it leaves us nice and fresh and ready to race on race day. So I hope that makes some sort of sense. And if you have any comments, please just pop them below. And for now, happy running!